Oh, for real? I can't see it all. All right, y'all, you're on your live. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rayshawn Ray. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, also vice president and director of the Equity Initiative at the American Institutes for Research. I'm so excited to have this conversation and welcome and honor Dr. Quincy Thomas Stewart to Washington, D.C. to talk about his book, Race in the Machine, a Novel Account. For those who may not know, basically everything I know about race and racism can be attributed to Quincy Thomas Stewart. Not only was I his research assistant, and he was one of my mentors at Indiana University where I got my PhD, but Quincy also spent an entire semester in a one-on-one independent study with me as an assistant professor when he didn't have time, when he should not have been doing that, spending multiple hours with me every single week, assigning me a new book every single week, and also a 2 to 4 page summary of that book in my own thoughts every single week, while he then spent all of that time with me. And so all of the work that I do in this space is in honor to Quincy. And he made me read books like The Emperor's New Clothes, Racial Formation, How Racial Statistics Lie, Black Wealth, White Wealth. I mean, I could just go on and on about those books. And now as I think about those books in the context of forming a foundation for me, Race in the Machine simultaneously forms that groundbreaking list for me. That independent study experience was just formidable for me, and it firmly established me as a race scholar to examine how race impacts social institutions. It also set the tone for how I mentor, because all that time you spent with me that you did not have to, that you probably should not have, is one of the reasons why I'm here today. And so, I tell you this often about how much you mean to me, but being here, I would not have missed it, because I would not be the scholar I am. I would argue the man I am, the father I am, if it wasn't for you. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this. Your guidance, your gifts, your brotherhood, your example has really, really been special for me. So thank you. With that being said, let's talk about the book. Had to get that out the way first. Some might call this book, and this is what some of the scholars who reviewed it have talked about it. It's an amazing cover. It's so Quincy, right? It's an amazing cover. I love it. Even your picture on the back of the jacket is also so you. It's a phenomenal book. I really enjoyed reading it. And it's what some might call an Afro-futuristic book, a form of social science fiction. I believe you've even used that term. It's a unique book for an academic, particularly with your theoretical and methodological skill set to write a book like this. I mean, the subtitle is, of course, a novel account. What made you write this book, and how did you come up with the premise?
So that's a good question. But first, before I want to respond and say thank you very much for the kind words. Rashawn I think you were this part of the second cohort, because I didn't recruit Jason, but he was the first cohort that I recruited in Indiana. And I remember the moment we were, he had been in the department and sort of worked his way around the department. His mama was there. It was really cool. We made a sale. But we get in the car, and I was driving him around the city. And then he was sitting in the passenger seat, and he said, "Is that Face?" And I was like, I turned up the volume, and he was like, "Oh shit!" I was like, at that moment, I knew I had him. I was like, "He's coming in here." So at that point, I was like, "We're there." But that was a special moment. But and just many after that. So this is, I've been saying off and on and describing it as it comes out of failure, in the respect that there were some things that I wanted to do and things that I wanted to become, and it did not become, thankfully, it did not become those things, because this project early on started off as me trying to figure out a way to simulate how many races it takes to create racial inequality. It was like this really simple idea, because my students in my race class would always say, hey, there's a lot of racists. It's those folks out there that are responsible for racial inequality. And I'd say, how many? Where are they at? How do it work? And so I decided to play around and simulate this. And so when I was doing this and building this model, I tried to publish it in different ways in different places. But thankfully, it didn't get published in those places, even though I wanted it to at those times. But what came of those things was just some interaction with individuals about sort of allegories and other sorts of things. In particular, there was a moment when I was writing, and I knew this was going to be a book the entire time, but I wrote an allegory. I think I shared this allegory with you, and I sent it along with the book précis to the editor at Stanford. And she looked at it, she's like, this is really good, can you make the rest match this? And I was like, oh shit, okay, I could do that. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago, and that sort of made me really think about, maybe there's this other way to think through doing academic writing, and led me to really, play with literature and take a deep dive into literature, which has been an odd sort of endeavor. I mean, I talk to colleagues some of who are here, and I keep asking, you read fiction? I'm like, no, I don't read fiction. It's like I've been this lone wolf out in the desert someplace doing this. So I took a deep dive into fiction, but the idea behind it was to take this fictional world that, the simulation that I've been playing with, and then people kept on telling me, this is a representative of reality and so forth, and begin to expose, well, this is just one representation of reality. And there are many other representations of reality that we need to play with and explore, and they're very much the same as this one. So it's really trying to get at how we view race and the ways that we view race, and particularly the consequences of those ways. And so as I was playing with it, it was trying to figure out a way to both express this desire to change how people think about race, but also to do it in a new way that was at odds sort of with the traditional story, particularly the scientific narrative. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean it does make sense, and I'll just say we'll probably do this throughout this conversation. I vividly remember riding in the car with you when you put that song on, and I did have a moment. I said, I think I can come to Indiana with this brother. I think, what I thought was, I was like, I think he's gonna take care of me. He's gonna train me, and all that has been true. And beyond your scholarly work and all the things you've done, and you spoke to it a little bit. Where did you draw the inspiration to write this book in this way? I mean, for those who don't know, essentially, and Quincy will read some of the book shortly. But I mean, this book is essentially an Afro-futuristic social science fiction way of thinking about race in America, and I would argue throughout the world, and not just in this particular context, and not just in the past, but even in the future, which is really, I mean, it could almost be said anywhere. I mean, it is just a wonderful read. So I'm thinking about the inspiration to write a book like this that's not a traditional sociological text of, you being a professor at Northwestern and previously Indiana before that, and, shout out to Penn where you got your PhD, and shout out to Norfolk where you went before that. And so, I mean, where did you draw the inspiration from? They're supposed to say something.
So where did I draw the inspiration from? Well, in this case, there was a few moments, or a few writers actually that I've seen some on the shelves around here that I just got consumed with. I mean, Octavia Butler and others, and I was really consumed with how one could use stories to tell, at least to convey realities and to change individuals. And that's sort of the idea of a story. More so, when we think about social science, we think about changing the individual by giving them some information or something along those lines, and they're going to magically interpret the statistic, and then wow, they're going to have this magical insight. They're going to change, and they're going to be different from now on out. But stories in literature, there's also this tradition of change, and this goes back in just many religious traditions as well. How individuals use storytelling as a means to convey some truth. And that was sort of the idea. And one of the individuals that I remember when I first bumped into was Colson Whitehead. I saw his book that when the Underground Railroad had just come out. But I saw The Intuitionist, and I was like, that looks really cool. You know, this Intuitionist is this earlier one. This is when he was a little more technical. And so it's a book about elevator repairmen. And it was just like it was about race and elevator repairmen. But the way he built up this notions of the science of elevator repair, it just resonated with me. It just said this sounds like social science. And so when I started reading more of other authors, like Isaac Asimov and Kay Jemison and others, I started seeing this sort of tendency to build worlds that are very similar to social sciences. And so one of the goals of sort of moving in this direction was to build a world that felt, I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can skim past some of this stuff in there, like people do in regular social science books, science fiction books. So when you see Asimov talking about interstellar travel, you don't pay attention to exactly how it works. You just read through it and you're like, this is how it works. But in this case, you can read through it and get caught up in it if you want to. But the idea was to describe the social scientific context like that in a way that's oddly familiar. Specifically because you want to give something to people that they're familiar with, but also abstract them from the context a little bit to make people uncomfortable. So there was a goal of trying to engage the reader. And particularly, there were certain authors that I liked a lot that directly engaged the readers. And David Foster Wallace was one of them, and a few others that just sort of they have a weird way of engaging the reader that is almost inappropriate, but at times it's very effective. In pulling readers into the manuscript. This is one of the ways is the footnotes. I mean, you've seen the footnotes. They're everywhere. But the footnotes, it's one of the beautiful things. David Foster Wallace does this it's absurd in many respects. I mean, infinite jest. It's like those 1,200-page books with 300 pages of footnotes. But as you're going back and forth, and he's taking you back and forth, and you're playing a game with him. And over time, you're softening up, and he's doing something to you. You don't even realize what's happening, and you're slowly but surely sort of being indoctrinated into the world in different ways. And so it was an exploration about can I, in some respects, sort of build a story where we engage individuals like this, where people are sort of a part of the process, feel like they're engaged with me, or engaged in a classroom setting, or engaged in some way, shape, or form with a work.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got caught up with the footnotes and the appendix and the author Q&A at the end of the book, which was a neat way to bring it into play. And then thinking about pushing readers in an inappropriate way. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading the book, I kept thinking about how a machine seems to supersede a system, a social system, if you will, in the way that we think about it from a sociological standpoint. And you say in the book, you say, quote, "The diverse actors cooperate and collaborate in myriad ways, building a distinct social machine with codes such as constitutions, canons, statutes, regulations, resolutions, policies, and laws on how to collectively mine the environment." You go on to say that the social machine embodies the entirety of nuanced, shared forms that bind the collector organism, linking the individual actors together as a single cooperative unit. Can you discuss the social machine in relation to the social system or social institution? Where do you place the machine in this relationship?
That's a good question. Thank you. That was one of the ones when you sent these along. I was like, that's a good one. I like it.
When your mentor says it's good, it's a good question.
That's good. I mean, the thing about it is, this is the power of metaphor. Well, it's not supposed to perfectly match. And so when you think about a social machine, there's always some slippery difference where it's not exactly how things fit on. And so that's the way it's supposed to feel. And so in some respects, you can think of it as a social system, but when people think about social systems, I don't think people think about them as complex systems. I mean, sort of complex systems is a field. You know, it's a way of thinking about the world of how individuals within organizations or within networks and so forth interact. But in this respect, the goal is, in many respects, like something. In many respects, this is like an artist flattening the canvas. And so the goal is to take the idea of a social machine. So in the book, there are pattern recognition machines. There are a population of pattern recognition machines. They exist in a world where they're interacting, not like fading in and out of this, but I feel like I am. Maybe not. Okay, y'all hear me clearly the entire time? Okay.
It definitely feels like that from up here, though. I think.
No, you're okay.
Okay, good. Okay. But the social machine, that keeps on. But the social machine, and what it makes us, what the idea is that the social machine is where the pattern recognition machines connect. And so pattern recognition machines connect to create these large social machines, which can form into like educational social machines or economic social machines, and they mine the environment for goods. And they go out and they divide these goods into resources, and we divide these goods and so forth. And so that's the basic, at least metaphor that's going on in the model. The idea there is to provide a way to at least, again, like a painter sort of flattening a canvas. This is a way to flatten the landscape to try to get out of thinking about different distinctions between social institutions and so forth, and particularly to get individuals out of thinking about structures as those institutions. Because that's one of the things when people think about structure, they think about the educational structure or something along those lines. And one of the parts of this is to get people thinking about structure as beyond all of that. It's something that's above what we typically think of as social institutions, things that are sort of behind the scenes, that's embedded in the substrate of the field. And so the goal with the machine was to at least just simplify that relationship, that there are lots of pattern recognition machines where it exists all around. We figure out things from our landscape and we interact with each other and construct these huge machines. And we do cool things with these huge machines and so forth. And we construct machines for families and so forth. And so it's really just to flatten the landscape. And with that, allow me to sort of map on to some of the ideas of the simulation to begin to think about, hey, maybe there's a metaphorical connection between how these machines connect and how these algorithms operate between machines. So that was the notion of the machine. And I brought it in the machine because I also like the idea of a social mechanic, because we're both Robert Wood Johnson scholars in health policy research. And one of the big things they push is policy relevance. You have to change things. What's the policy? And so with social mechanic, you're supposed to find a way to change the machine. And so it sounded like a viable action, or at least a viable role for an institute to play. And so that's where I like the idea of machines. And of course, the sort of ghost in the machine notion and so forth. I was like, okay, there's a way we can play out here. There's a race in the machine. Is it a ghost or something along those lines was the idea. But that's the basic substrate of things. But that's sort of where the machine comes into things and thinking about how what's happening between us if we're just machines. What's the social part that's happening, and how can we change that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading it, I was definitely having these moments where I was thinking, okay, what is the machine? Is it alive? What is it doing? And of course, you tell us it is alive, but then I was thinking, to what extent is it alive? And accordingly, you juxtapose the cultural versus the systemic, and even the mechanical processes of race that you just mentioned. You talk about how race is internal, and you just mentioned this, and you say, quote in the book, that race is beneath the network of circuits, fluid, and waste conduits, hardware, processes, and pumping chambers. Can you unpack this for readers to have a framework by which to think about this and process the book in terms of it? You just spoke to how you think about the machine in the context of the social system, but really getting at the way that race is beneath the network of circuits. It's mechanical in nature. I mean, it really made me think about, the way that George Herbert Mead used to try to explain the social organism to, hard sciences or whatnot. I'm curious if you can help us think about this framework and what does it mean to be beneath these circuits?
And so one of the things that's sort of initially that's actually I'm thinking that's like I forgot exactly, it's like the third or fourth section of part one, but that's there's a pattern that I'm pointing to. That's the initial part of the pattern. That's sort of, but it's this recursive pattern that race occurs both without and within. But in that respect, it's pointing to both research, but also just an abundance of this variety of areas that race is felt in many respects inside, whether it be implicit attitudes, whether it be, I mean, you and I could sort of think about this in a very simple sense, in the respect that you walk down the street, you see different individuals walking back and forth, you feel it. Those are actual responses that are taking place inside of you. That are like your cortisol is going up or going down and so forth, depending on who's there. And so, I mean, there's a variety of things, and we change based on others to try to make them feel safer and worse. I mean, so there's all these things that are going on inside of us, and that is a function of training, which is kind of crazy, because you think this is no different than implicit attitudes. And one of the individuals, I mean, this speaks to implicit attitudes. I mean, Jen Richardson's research, I think we bumped into her together at ASA a few years ago, but her research on implicit attitudes showing that they're not just implicit attitudes, they're associated with deeper tendencies, associated with stress in interracial interactions, they're associated with bad, I mean, there's just a variety of things that go along inside that are taking place. And so it's the pullings that our bodies are responding to the stimuli because they've been trained in many respects in the system to respond to the stimuli. But so to pull in that race is not only something out there that's in the landscape, it's something that's inside of us as well. And the idea is to show this recursive pattern, that there's this layering going on.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking about how things are on the inside of us and the struggle that you talk about in the book, you tell the story of a social war where a population is an organism. I think people might find it puzzling to think about population as a living organism. Can you talk about this conceptualization?
It was, again, part of this. This was for me, it was a fun way to play around with demography and thinking about measurement. But a population is an organism in the respect that when you think of like ant mines, that's an organism. I mean, they're moving together and they're connected in this fundamental way. We might not see the actual connections, but there's a fundamental connection between them. And so the idea is to say, build up this notion of a population as an organism that's going out looking for resources and consuming resources. And this is the organic part of it. And so to create this notion of there is this organic sort of veneer of a population. But within this population, there is this social machine. There are these ways that the actors inside interact with each other and how they share the bounty to this sort of this enterprise. And so it's to pair those two things together, but also it's mapping onto what I mentioned earlier. It's a way to flatten the world. And so thinking about both the organic in the population sense, but then the social mechanical. But the nice thing, at least for me, when thinking about the social mechanical, is it's not an abstraction of the population per se, and so it's something that is not complete, not a complete description of the population. But that's what we as social scientists sort of consume with. We miss sort of the organic part of the population, sort of the consuming of resources and so forth. But it's to pair those two things together. It's one of them. It's one of the things that I'm trying to do is to pair these sorts of different depictions of race or different depictions of phenomena in different ways.
You definitely complicated it, I think, for people, and at the same time, have it set up that makes it, I think, really accessible for people to think about. I mean, I think about the age of our kids and whether or not, how consumable this would be. I think it would be. I think it would challenge them to think about the world in different ways, and their minds would go in different places. The book opens as a creation story in many respects. It talks a lot about things occurring in, 7 days at a time, and, those sort of things were going on. Was it deliberate to connect to biblical and religious texts in terms of creation? And in answering the question, I hope that you might be able to read some of the first chronicle from the beginning of the book, because, as you know, it's pretty foundational.
So yes, it was. Bros are going to say that 7 is all about the jewels. And the others are going to say, well, it's all about creation story and so forth, the 7th day, the Sabbath, and so forth. For me, it was just like there was a repetitive feature that I dug about it, and there's a pattern in there where it's like it's all pointed out. It's like 7, but then there's this expanse. We don't know how long it was, but there is this tendency to, in certain sections, to draw on religious iconography or religious sort of ways of speaking because there's just this tradition of storytelling in religion, of telling truths, and there's the second to last what's this interlude. It draws on the Bhagavad Gita, talk slowly. But just to make a case about the incompleteness of methods. But it's not written that way, but it's a similar story. So it's creating a proof in many respects, but it's done so through the context of a story. And so that's one of the areas that I drew from. I read lots of just old religious texts, just thinking through how are individuals conveying these stories and so forth. So that was a part of that idea of trying to figure out how to tell mystical sounding stories, or stories that are, you have all these books behind you and chakras and other sorts of things, but these are the types of things, these people are reading these stories, they're conveying some sort of truth to them. And so that was the goal, was to feed on that kind of spirit for certain parts of the text, to contrast with some of there's technical, with science fiction kind of writing in other parts of the text. And so the goal was to contrast those two sorts of things in many respects. So one can almost feel like background noise, and another can sort of feel more organic and more connected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's always fascinating to hear authors talk about the why behind what we read. And as you're talking, and I'm reflecting on reading the book, I had those feelings. Like I was like, there's all this other stuff happening here, and I'll be going back, flipping back pages, moving forward pages, just trying to connect the novel and the story. But go ahead.
There's a layer. And first, with my colleagues, before I go into this, with my colleagues at Northwestern, Kathleen Carmichael, she's a professor in writing and engineering somehow. She teaches in the Civil Design Center. But for several years, I was part of a residential college program, the chair of this residential college, and we would walk back and forth to the garage together. And I would just pick her brain about, okay, why is this how to do this? Why is this how to do this? Why is this, trying to pick up these sorts of tendencies. But one of the things that we sort of overlapping themes was there's this weave that authors do in the context of novels. It's just really fascinating because just like you hit on certain things, you drop certain nuggets early on, and they come around later on. And it's seen in just a variety of different stories. So I'll jump in real quick. Okay, so this is the Creation Chronicle. So this story begins in a cave in the mountains of the fifth direction. A group of monks gathered quietly to learn about the beginning and the end, and the path forward. They had gathered before, and they roughly knew the narrative. However, none had gathered in this place, a remote sacred cave, in this space, the presence of a beloved saint, even the gods envy, to learn the whole legend from her. This gathering, all those in attendance, it was special. The mountains holding the sacred cave overlooked their entire lives, emerging from the barren landscape of the four directions, rising to the distant peaks of their awareness. They glowed purple as the sun rose, revealing a marvel of rugged, steep terrain. This top shone white more than half the year. Their monasteries decorated the foothills. As children, these monks planted seeds. They played pretend and imitated the strange habits of their seniors, As they grew, they prepared and trained. They became genuine monks, esteemed members of the monastery and herd. Then they were the admired ones, those chosen for the journey. They would ascend the sacred mountains, learn a legend. These monks traveled by foot to the sacred place, connecting with each other at small outposts on the way. They passed tiny villages which became transient camps as they collectively moved deeper into the mountains. The first guide left them after 7 days of ascent. Another guide, a principal monk that had previously visited and learned the legend, took them 7 days further. Then came disappointment. He left them to transcend the divide alone. Primates sparsely inhabited this space. The landscape was unbecoming to agricultural habitat, placing great demands on the party as they traversed this empty, desolate divide in the mountainous terrain. After slowly crossing the divide, feeling like they barely survived their journey through an emotional and intellectual abyss, they traveled 7 days beyond it to find her. Only she spoke the legend, the beginning and the end of race and the herd. Others knew parts. The senior monks they encountered as children often spoke of these parts. Still others that knew the whole, the principal monks who quietly roamed this landscape, would not convey it. Only she would speak the whole. She distilled parts to an esteemed few, the ones almost ready to hear the primordial seeds. Of those, a smaller select group who trained in her company, steadily practicing, perfecting their minds for years, heard the whole. Only they could hear the whole. These are the monks gathered. They are sitting in the sacred cave in the mountains of the fifth direction, about to hear the whole legend from her. Each of these monks, sitting in the sacred space, on the precipice of new understanding, it is special. The saint, unhurriedly entering the cave, holding the arm of a young assistant, then carefully sitting down on a cushion, compassionately walking the slept group. They were captivated by her. She sat with them, her tender wrinkled hands lovingly holding one another in her lap as the young assistant inconspicuously moved around, placing bowls in front of each visitor. Still in all, her presence on this occasion inspiring socially shared visceral tingles in the group. They quietly ate around the fire. As they finished, the fire burned to ember. Silence. She smiled faintly at those present, gently bowed, and began to speak the legend.
Yeah, I mean, that part, the beginning of the book, definitely several places throughout the book really stood out to me about how he was setting this up. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking about how, the most novels have a protagonist. Yours is no different, but what stood out is that at times it read as if the actual machine was the protagonist in many regards. I mean, in terms of going through the book, and I don't know if people watch Black Mirror, if they, have seen Minority Report, but I mean, I put, I'm like, this book could be a show or a movie in terms of thinking about race and kind of making a play on that. Did you purposefully bring in the machine to be a key character of the book?
Yes. And so that was part of the idea, was to get three, in this case, there are three different types of dialogues, in particular there are three types of protagonists. And one is this machine, that it's the unnamed protagonist. But in the context of that, there's, within that machine, there's author, which is another sort of character, which you don't find out until the end, really. But author is in there, but it's subtle. And that's sort of the beautiful thing, again, about metaphors. Sometimes you can interpret things in a few different ways. But there's the machine as a protagonist. But then there's in the creation chronicle, the saint is partly the protagonist, but there's another protagonist who's a scientist. Asia is a protagonist. But then there's, in the interludes, there's an odd protagonist, which is the reader becomes a protagonist. And the reader's engaged in a different way. In many respects, it was like, I was looking at it in some respects, like, how would I engage myself, right, as a reader and so forth. And so and that's sort of the introspective sort of question that comes about with that. But it was in some respects, it's a goal of sort of creating some confusion around identity and sort of how one is being defined particularly, but also how one is looking at the world. And that happens in a few ways when Veda teaches the protagonist how to connect internally to Babel, the library of sorts and so forth. But there are these different steps where there's you see a little brief dissociations between the protagonists, or what's going on in the protagonist's head. But yes, there's a lot of that, and that was again the beauty of the mechanical, for me, the social mechanical idea of thinking who's talking and so forth. And experimental fiction allows you to do those sorts of things. So,
yeah. As I was reading it, it's funny to hear you talk about these multiple protagonists, because this is one of the ways I was like, this has to be a machine, because Quincy hasn't told us who the author is, and then I get to the end, I don't really want to give it away. I mean, he essentially alluded to it, but I was like, okay, it actually is a person. But then as I'm reading in the middle of the book, I was like, Quincy's messing with me. Like, he's messing with us. Like, he's purposefully trying to confuse us, right? So I was thinking about that as I was reading the book, and I mean, I want to shift and talk about how you are actually talking about race in the book. I mean, you are one of the most foremost methodologists who study race in America, and I will argue around the world, and yet you say, quote, "I doubt the measures we use to depict race." You say much later in the book, and you alluded to this earlier, that researchers are like artists. And I think sometimes when people hear art, they think subjectivity, that is some kind of way that it's lost rigor. So I have two kind of a two-part question. First, why do you doubt measures and methodological approaches? And in many ways, I know the answer to this because we talk about it a lot, but it'd be important for the audience. And what does this doubting mean for people outside of the academy, people here at Sankofa Bookstore, to trust empirical findings on race and racism?
So why should we trust empirical findings? What does the doubting mean? I'm going to ask you about the second question in a second. But the first question, why sort of doubt measures and methods and so forth. So this speaks to just a body of research. You were actually a part of some of this that I've been tinkering with for several years, but it speaks to our capacity to model race and sort of come up with clean solutions. And so one of the areas that I wrote on several years ago was just there's a battery of methods that sociologists and other social scientists use. They're regression methods, and they go out and they find data, and they crunch all these numbers. And one of the things we keep doing is what I like to call chasing the race effect. And so we figure out what explains the race effect. It's like, well, maybe it's where people live. Well, maybe it's people's behavior. And we keep going after the next thing, and it's every new generation of scholars keeps on adding. It's like it's like a conference. You show up and every new guy walks up to you, a new gal walks up to you and says, hey, I got this next paper and I got this new variable. And we're like, fuck, yeah. But so it's in that respect, it's sort of getting at this our capacity to do that. And so some of that work that I did was using simple simulations to kind of show that, hey, these fancy models that we're developing, they really don't capture what we think they're capturing. They're capturing much deeper and more complex processes than we think they are. And so even though they seem like they work, and so it's like, well, the model tells us get more education, you earn more money. It's like, yeah, that works. But does it work when we say all blacks get more education? Does it work when we start to take these on a larger scale? And so that work was really sort of showing that when we switch how we look at race, instead of looking at race as an individual characteristic, when we start looking at race as something that happens between individuals, that it changes how we measure things, and it changes our capacity to find, really at least find measures that are beyond, that are at least good measures beyond the basic statistics of differences in life expectancy or differences in education. I'm thinking there's just really fantastical models where people will say, well, if you're a black person and you have the right education, or you live in the right neighborhood, you live in the right place here, you do all this other stuff, and you talk the right way, that you'll be Jesus or something along those lines. But that's the sort of thinking, and sort of that's what I've been arguing against in this book. There's that argument is there. It's taken up in the interludes, and it's taken up in different parts. And it's taken up, I think, in this effect, more an effective nature, where it's using Gödel as a mathematician. This is proof of incompleteness. He was Einstein's best friend. They used to walk around together at the Institute for whatever that place is, what I'm talking about. It's like the god for social sciences, or at least
Institute for Advanced Study.
Institute for Advanced Study, yes. That's where everybody wants to be, because I guess. But that's where they used to walk in the woods together and talk about math. And that's what he created the Institute for Advanced Study for, so he could hang out with Gödel. But Gödel wrote this really cool proof on the incompleteness of math. And it basically shows that you can't you can't model a system with math. It's incomplete. And to the extent that we are sort of inside a system, one can't extrapolate and figure out how to sort of come to some novel systemic, or at least way to correct an inequality within that system. It's just that there's an incompleteness to the math. And that's what, in this sort of context, that it comes across as. At least that's how we make the argument here. But it's written in a much more, it's not written in Gödel's language, it's written in a much more religious language, because Gödel's point is mirrored in religious texts. It's really quite fascinating, because there's actually a good book written by Hofstadter, who wrote Gödel Bach, but it's this book about algorithms, but it won the Pulitzer several years, 1978. But the cool thing about it is he's showing that Gödel's theorem sort of applies to lots of these recursive properties, but it also maps on sort of Zen Buddhist beliefs. It maps on there's a variety of areas it just sort of maps on nicely to it. So it's using that language to make the similar proof.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think, as we think about kind of questioning how we approach, as sociologists and social scientists, how we approach our research, and then more so the data that we use, the incompleteness of it, and even the incompleteness of our approaches, how should the public be then receiving the public, the work that we actually publish and what we put out? And of course, there's a level of skepticism, particularly among Black people, there's a rational distrust. I think the rationality is so important. That there's a rational distrust of research in the scientific process. How do we reconcile that?
That's one of the reasons I wrote this, is that I don't think it's easily reconcilable, because I think in many respects the Black community has I think there's a collective intelligence that's figured a lot of the stuff that we see in our social scientific models out. There's a quote that I don't think I left it in the book, but you read this quote when I used it a long time ago. Lawrence Otis Graham, when his son was accosted at some sort of Tony resort, some camp or something along those lines, he wrote this op-ed in the New York Times where he was telling the people, it's like, well, I teach my kids to wear the right clothes, to not wear things with names on them, to dress a certain way and tie their shoes and not wear sunglasses, not wear a hat, all this stuff. And basically he's like, look, we tell our kids to dress and be as white as possible and they'll be cool. But it's like all those things are parts of our regression model. It's like we want years of education. We want, where'd you get that education? There's just a variety of aspects of things that we've been trying to sort of figure out that in many respects I think that we've known as a collective in different ways. But as far as what that means for how individuals should interpret these data, this is written as a parody of the academy. In some respects, I hope people to question the data, to begin to question and say, well, when the person jumps forward and says, look, I can solve it, he's like, whoa, yeah. But because I think that's a part of, we become it's a market. There's a market to at least, and that's sort of, not to give away sort of the end, but there is this duality of if we live in a system that is racialized, that means, and this is the question I pose my students at the beginning of quarters is, what's it feel like to be successful in a racist society? That's sort of it's a hard thing, because should we respond and say, well, get all the shit you can, because this is a racist space and you gotta do you. But, that's to the detriment of the greater good, or do we say this is a racist space? How do we undermine this space? And that's a different question. And so that's sort of the idea that I want to juxtapose. And this isn't a new question. Du Bois talked about this in his duality. Fanon talked about it in his sort of facades. I believe in his conservative way, talked about it with oppositionality. But it's like there's this ongoing sort of dissonance that's taking place. And that's sort of one of the areas that I want people to think more deeply about. And think about when they see those statistics and think, what exactly does this entail? Does this entail real change? And that's one of the things that's, in part, this is a proof of selflessness. And that's sort of a different thing that comes across. And you have to ask, is this selfless? But then people start to want to measure selflessness, and then it changes the metric. And so there's this recursive aspect of it. But that's sort of yeah. You get it?
Yeah, most definitely. As you think about
Who's the last person you said after Obama?
Agbu. He's a very conservative cat.
Say his name again.
Agbu, OGBU. What is his first name?
Jonathan Agbu.
Jonathan Agbu, yes. Agbu, he wrote, he did a lot of stuff on Shaker Heights outside of Cleveland. And a lot of stuff in the educational institutions and so forth, ethnography in educational institutions. But he came up with a theory of oppositional culture. But it was along the same lines as Du Bois' duality. People have talked about these things in different ways, in different forms over the years. That's one of the other things that, in the context of this, is to point out that we look for theories to say, who's wrong and who are sort of the vampires, or who are the individuals that are to blame for racial inequality. And part of what this is trying to do is convey a systemic perspective to say, well, it's all working together. And so, are there racist vampires out there? Yeah, they kind of exist. Are there minority victims out there, like Agbu talked about? Yeah, they kind of exist in different ways. It might not look like he talked about, but they exist in different ways. But the point is to say that these things are all sort of fluid. They're moving back and forth with each other. And one is complementing the others, one is not. It's a nature of the machine, and that's sort of another aspect of it, that this is something that's algorithmic and repetitive.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Agbu was problematic because he left out structure, right? He was assuming that culture mattered, that black kids didn't do well in school because they didn't want to be white. When there are all these structural components that you're talking about, and you started this response by talking about, Otis Graham's Our Kind of People and the way that black people aim to embody respectability politics, that if we dress and look the part that we want to experience that. And then as you noted, Graham's son was called the N-word doing all these things, right? And we have to think about what that does to our own psyche when we have told our kids that they should do something and act a particular way and dress a particular way, and it still doesn't matter. And you brought up just a second ago vampires. You know what? I found this to be a fascinating part of the book. I was like, Quincy is talking about white folks as vampires. Essentially what he's talking about, right? And you talk about three figures that guide race in the machine: the racists, the structures, and the structures and the victims. And you describe these racists as vampires sucking the resources from the perceived more inferior group that you call the pandas, right? That's the shorthand version of what you call them. And thinking about this, and you just brought it up, and I want to ask you, what do you say to people who think that victimhood suggests failure on behalf of those experiencing discrimination? And I'm also curious, what do you say to members of the pandas that may actually think the same way, whether that be a Otis Graham, or maybe that's a Jason Whitlock for those who follow sports and think about, thinking about these broader characters today that embody these different ideal types that you draw out. So on one hand, what do you say to people who think that victimhood suggests failure? And then what do you say to members of the pandas who might actually think the same way?
Well, I think in that respect, it's the question sort of goes back to the notion, again, it's a system, right? That, hey, if you, again, I wholly disagree with the person saying, hey, it's victimhood, it's this, it's like, well, yeah, you can have you're a little bit right. There's a lot going on, so you can't look at one thing. And so, and that sort of speaks to this other aspect. It's funny, there's this work I cite in here by Mesmer Destin. He's a colleague at Northwestern in CESP and psychology. But he does these cool experiments where he gives kids information on financial aid and other access to information, and he gives other kids some sort of leadership exercise, and he finds out that these kids who've gotten access to basically information about access to college and resources, then they start studying more and they start doing all this. It's this really cool experiment where you can just sort of manipulate what the impact of structures or informational structures are on behavior. And so the idea is to really, again, showcase that and make people think about this. It's a larger system. And so when I look at actors in these different environments, when they're sort of articulating out, to take an actual individual and say, they're the person, they're championing victimhood. But it's I don't agree with the sort of, the extent to which they champion victimhood. But I think that this, to bring up in here is to contextualize that as, again, it's part of the system. And all these things are happening at the same time. And yeah, that's a small part of the story. That's cool, at least for me, I like that, because it's like, don't get caught up in these other things. There's a bigger game afoot. Keep reading is the idea. But that was an area. There's vampires, which are white. It's not white vampires, but they're vampires. So the great thing about vampires.
That's what they are.
So Dracula was written, and I draw in Dracula quite a bit, because Dracula is written, and it's cool because it's written like these journals, entries and so forth amongst these characters, like 7 or 8 characters. But it's written to really think about there's this burgeoning sort of group of immigrants, Eastern Europeans, that are going to come to Great Britain and suck our resources away from us. And so they paint these vampires as a sort of evil other who's coming over. And it's really cool because they go back and forth between countries, and they build up. And they don't even say vampire until like page 400 or something. But it's just so creepy. But the idea, though, again, it pulls off that same rhetoric, because they were writing these type of novels to really speak to what was going on in the population at the time. They were saying, hey, there's this beast out there, these Eastern Europeans, and they're going to come here and they're going to take our shit, and we need to do something about it. But they're saying that in a kinder way. They're vampires and they're odd and so forth. So.
Yeah, as I'm thinking about this.
I'm sorry, I'm cussing my other kids. I cuss
Several times.
I cuss in front of my kids all the time. I just have to make sure it's still not rich.
That's hilarious.
That's my own kids abuse.
You know, as you talk about resources, people view resources as either you have them or you don't. And so you talk in a book about zero sum logics, right? Tell people how you use zero sum logic in your book, and then how we might address it. Because, you know, and I'm going to pivot in these last few questions before we open it up to the audience, is even though, of course, your book grapples with ways that we might see more racial inequality, ways we might see less. You know, we'll get into the national bargaining game in a second because it's such a powerful part of the book and something you've worked on for a long time. But just on this part, that people think that there is a pile of resources, and if they have them and someone else gets some, then they're losing some. So talk about how you grapple with zero sum logic and how we might address it in everyday life.
Yeah, so that's one of the questions that comes up, at least been engaged a lot. That's why I tried to bring up at different points to really engage that point in the book. But the zero sum logic, it's just based off this simple idea of status. I mean, we think of, everybody thinks of, you know, sometimes when we think of resources as far as race, people say, oh, well, resources are infinite, you know, just a matter of time, you guys will catch up and they'll get some, and, you know, you'll get your share eventually, sort of thing. But when we think of status is something, so if we're in a room and a couple people have status, the rest don't, you know, it's just, you can't all have status because then it's not status, then you're just all the same people, you know. Status implies that somebody has it and somebody does not. And so just from that base notion of status comes this idea of race as an aspect of status, or a character, at least an embodiment of status in that respect. And so when we think about resources, and this sort of speaks to the zero-sum game, some of the arguments again saying, you know, resources are infinite, but our mentality, our capacity to think about resources is finite. So in any case, when we come back to this notion of zero-sum, it is, at least in the context of race, that one group gets more and another gets less, in the respect, and I say it's zero-sum in the respect that there is a loser here. There's people, you know, when we say, you know, resources are infinite and so forth, this is the pivot of the conversation, because economists have been saying for a long period of time that resources are infinite. You know, resources, well, they won't run out, and things are just, you know, the way they are. And the point was to say, no, just take a very simple context of a room. If there's racial status in this room, and a few people have it, that means the other people do not. And it's to expound on that very simple idea of, you know, hey, there's a state of status, some people get it and some people do not. We divide that unequally, and when that happens consistently over and over and over again, and that's part of the aspect of us connecting into these large machines. When we hook up as a couple of pattern recognition machines as a social machine, and one of us consistently gets less over and over again, millions of times across the course of our interactions, it adds up, and we get these disparities that we currently see. So that's part of the point, is to really convey that's very simple simplicity. That's when I teach the class on race, my undergrad class. I begin with just put up a piece of the pie. I'm like, this is all about people saying, I deserve more, and sort of going back. But it's something to just keep coming back to, because we lose sight of it. We lose sight of it and we start thinking we can play this game and sort of get around it. But the point underlying all of it is that, you know, there's a system that we're building where we're granting one group more resources and opportunities than another group. And resources in this respect are broad. Again, the story is a metaphor. It's a single level metaphor, but resources could be anything. Resources could be income, resources could be wealth, resources could be just a variety of things. And so the goal is to again flatten the landscape, to tell a very simple story that conveys a complex understanding of race.
In thinking about flattening the landscape, I'm hoping that you can talk about the Nash bargaining game and tell the audience about it, what it is, how you apply it in your book. And the reason why I think it's important, I mean, first off, in classic Quincy Stewart fashion, I was like, yes, of course Quincy included tons of graphs and figures. There should be no other way. Even though it's a novel, you about to get a whole bunch of graphs and figures and understand that there's a whole bunch of stats behind it, so the algorithm doing its thing. So I'm curious if you can talk about the Nash bargaining game and whether, well, I'll stop there. Tell us about the Nash bargaining game and how you apply it in your book, and then I'll ask you about distributive justice and how that plays a role in this particular process in creating racial equity.
So Nash bargaining game it's a game theoretic game, and I mean he talks about the figures and so forth in the book. I can now say that they're art. You know, they're not figures, they're officially art. I hired an artist. We work together at length to develop these things, and it's art, and that's part of the play though too. It's to say that hey, this is serious research, but is it? It's kind of art, and so that's kind of the way. And there are certain ways that she really like this to at least convey things as a surface, which aren't necessarily surfaces. But the Nash bargaining game is something. It's a game based on distributive justice, but it's just a very simple idea for at least two individuals meeting in an encounter, and they're just dividing a good. They're trying to figure out how much of a good do I deserve and how much of a good do you deserve. And so the game goes, two people randomly encounter one another, and if it has a value of 100, those are the other graphs. But they're drawn. The ones in part 2 are the ones that, but before that with the robots. That's the ones that.
Okay, those are the ones.
Yeah, well, she did both of those. She did all of them. But yeah, those are the ones that with the robots. I like those better. I'm sorry. I had a blast working on it. Audrey, she was a student from University. She's an artist at University of Chicago. But the Nash bargaining game. Two actors come together. They're bidding on their share of a good. And this good could be anything. That's the point of the game. Is in the point of game theory in general, is to figure out how actors respond in these really in playing these games where there's uncertainty involved. And so, in this case, actors come together. They make a bid on the good. If their sum of their bids is greater than 100, they both receive no payout. If some of their bids is less than 100, they each receive their own. And so, actors, for the most part, should learn to bid really quickly 50. And so everybody walks away with an equal share. But in the game, what I play around with is what happens when a subset of actors decides, I'm going to bid more to the minority actors, the subordinate actors. What happens when they respond and so forth. And so in that respect, the game allows one to start thinking about how one group can begin to say, I want a little bit more resources than you, and how that affects a system. Not just an individual, but a larger system. But game theory is used in many respects to figure out tough models for decision making. There's some research cited in the in the notes on game theory by Robert Axelrod about cooperation and so forth. But it's really about trying to figure out how people make decisions under uncertainty. And this fleshes out race using that theory, using that model.
So, in thinking about the Nash bargaining game, do you think that distributive justice is the answer for creating racial equity?
Yes, sorry, I'm seeing graphs in my head of the Lorenz curve. I'm sorry, this takes me back to economics in grad school, but I'm seeing the Lorenz curve is this famous curve for determining inequality. But distributive justice, in that respect, I'm thinking about if we redistribute or finding what ways we can redistribute goods. I believe in the distributive justice aspect of sort of when we think about zero-sum games and so forth. But in the respect of the way we've traditionally thought of distributive justice with respect to regression models and trying to figure out what things can we redistribute to sort of make the model or make the world a better place. I'm less inclined to that sort of thinking. So and that's part of what, and this is part of the goal of the book isn't necessarily to say, do this or do that. It's to say, think about it. Just think about the world if it existed looking this way. How would you respond? And so the question isn't necessarily, is it distributive justice or is it not? It's more so to think about distributive justice or that perspective given a new landscape. If the landscape of inequality looks different, and it does. That's sort of the point of the book, is to say, hey, it looks different, because if you look at what happens between individuals and you think about race in that way, it changes everything. And your response, your capacity to undermine the system, it changes from, being excluded, something that just readjusts and sort of the system recalibrates itself. And so what this amounts to, a real world way to think about this is when Black people realize that when white people live in a neighborhood, houses are worth more. And so you buy houses in white neighborhoods, but then white people realize that Black people around makes their houses worth less than they need. And so then it's just like this recurring pattern. It's like, well, white people are the valuable thing here. Well, it's not necessarily, we want to say it's the houses, but there's something else going on here. And so that's, in thinking about redistribution in those respects, I want people to think about, hey, if there's this larger system operating, maybe the actions we think we're taking to sort of create equality might be furthering the equality in different ways, or cementing it in other ways. And what's the best action? That's where I come up with oftentimes. Each time I reread it, it's what is the best action in this case? And I struggle with it at different points in time, because sometimes it runs orthogonal. I had to use some matrices terms to what my interest may be. It runs counter to what my interest may be sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So, I got two more questions before we open it up. You just talked about something that becomes deeply personal. Of course, in the book, you take the reader from thinking about themselves as individuals to thinking about the system and the structure of the machine, and then all of the cultural stuff in the middle, the social minutiae and all the things that are happening. And one concept that really stood out to me was how you talked about the theoretical prison. The theoretical prison really stood out to me. And it comes up, much later in the book. And as I was thinking, I was like, wow, okay, this theoretical prison has been there all along. But you hadn't claimed it yet, as far as the author trying to reflect on it. You write about how we are all living in theoretical prisons, guided by a source code of thinking, right? The source code really picking up on the machine, talking about algorithms. And you talk about how not necessarily do people have a 12-step process as if they're an addict. You talk about a 1,200-step program. That in order for us to deal with our theoretical prison, you say that it will take a 1,200-step program. And of course, I was thinking about how in societies, 12 steps, and you're no longer going to be an addict, right? But of course, you have to keep doing all these other things, and you get a chip, and you do all this stuff. And I'm thinking, wow, 1,200 steps. A 1,200-step program is needed to change our thinking about racial inequality. Unpack that for us.
So of course, this is the beauty of metaphor, that you can play off concepts and make them, exaggerate them. And that's one of the beauty of art. It can be subversive in certain ways and allow you to exaggerate certain things and play off certain concepts, which is cool. So the theoretical prisons, it comes up at the end of the book in part 6, as well as in the coda. But it is, the basic idea of it, this is where it struck me, is that you can think of our world as, we each live in our own little houses. And we look out at the landscape, and we see different parts of the landscape and so forth. And we can't see the entire landscape, but we can see what we see outside of our windows. And then we make up our minds, in the context of our minds, we figure out what's between the windows. And that's how we live our lives. We see all these windows, and we sort of make inferences, and we build a world through these windows. And one of the ideas is that to make a case that, hey, these windows that we're looking out of the world of, these things are shaded. They're not clear windows, and they're biased. And so when we think about the connections between them also, and the way we sort of put them together, are biased as well. And so how do we get out of that sort of a connection, what that is embedded in the way we see the world? And that's sort of at least one of the impacting, at least for me, difficulties of sort of how does one extract oneself from the depth of this process, because we've all been conditioned in just countless ways. We watch TV for years, we've watched individuals for years, we've just been programmed, slowly but surely, about how the world works, about what's worth and so forth, and how do we unpack all of this. But the good thing about this is that this is, so the two ways one can think about this is that it's overwhelming and it's somewhere out there and you can't do anything about it. But the other, I mean, the cool thing to me is that it is right. It's right here. But I mean, but it's right here. I mean, it's something. It's us. You know that we can effectively change. It's not to say that we shouldn't do other things, but there is this process that takes place within oneself of how one relates to the system, how one tries to affect the system in different ways. What's the optimal action in that respect? It's a tough issue that comes up. But to get at it, the theoretical prisms it's to create a trap. I'm trying to put readers into a trap and put myself in many respects into a trap because until you feel the trap, you don't really understand. Once you see the trap and you feel the trap, then you can come up with a solution. This is like villains, 101 and superheroes and so forth. It's like
vampires.
Yes, exactly. But you have to feel trapped. You have to feel fully trapped, and that's sort of one of the areas that using the concept of theoretical prisms. But in the interludes, there's this other thing going on where the protagonist in the interlude is frustrated and sort of trying to figure out what's going on, and it's sort of to express again from a different vantage. There is this trap that they find themselves. And they just can't get out of. But there's a discussion of ways out of it in different ways, but story ways. But one of the things that I hope happens is that readers try to sort of, based on how the protagonist tries to find a way out of it, how the readers find their way out of it. How do you sort of deal with these sorts of things? And that's one of the things for me that I like. It's because I keep thinking of what is the best action? Because I want to do the best action all the time. I want to be the selfless actor and so forth. But it's a pursuit in many respects. And so the point of making that, and I mentioned in that same sentence, something like social cognitive behavioral therapy or something along those lines, or a metamechanical awakening or something. But the point is to say that this is really deep inside of us, and this is something that it takes a practice. It's not something that is just like, hey, okay, I'm going to throw some money at it over here, or once we march here, once we redistribute this, it's all good. No, this is a practice. This is a way of life, and it speaks to, and this sort of speaks to the proof again about when Martin Luther King or Gandhi or others, when they're doing their certain movements, there's a practice embedded in it. And there's a practice of selflessness that sort of speaks to what's going on. And the question again from that level is, well, is selflessness the way to do this? Or is that because they've been very successful and so forth. But Gandhi's pulled in different respects. But that's the point. The theoretical prism is to create this trap of what it actually means to be encompassed in a racial system. Because we don't think of racial systems as a system. We think of systems as, hey, there's an educational system, there's an economic system. It's like, no, a system. There's a dome, and we put inside of it, but it's invisible. It's a theoretical dome.
That's what made the machine so powerful, right? We can be doing all these different things on the inside, but we can even be part of different systems. The way that I thought about it is the machine can really encompass all these things, as you just said. It becomes a dome, and that became very clear. And as I was concluding the book and reflecting on it, I was thinking about, okay, who are the biggest victims? Who are the biggest losers here? And thinking about it in society, of course, oftentimes it's Black people. And in some respects, it's Black women, others is Black men. And one of the things I was thinking about in the context of Black men is that Black men are underrepresented in the top 10 occupations that are expected to grow over the next couple of decades. And we are overrepresented in the fastest dying occupations, right? And in the occupations that are set to grow, education, healthcare, tech. So as I was reading the book, I'm thinking about algorithms and how you're talking about algorithms, how you're talking about, technology in this era that we're in of technological innovation. And your book had me thinking about algorithms, of course, virtual reality and some of the spaces that I'm in, but even the way that a lot of Black people, Black men in particular, have really really bought into cryptocurrency. I was thinking about this in the context of chat GPT. I mean, it was all kinds of stuff that was going on in my head. And I'm curious if you were thinking about any of these things when you were writing, and how you think about what should be some of the takeaways of how race influences this era of tech.
Yeah, no, it was a space because I've always been fascinated with some of the AI stuff, especially when they're releasing the AI thing out to the public. They're like, hey, it's racist. And it's like, why is it racist? It just mirrors. Yes, exactly. It just sort of mirrors things back. I mean, so it was to sort of pull in some of this, just different types of thinking about connection. But again, this is drawing on a metaphor. It's just part of the reason is to change the relationship between the reader and the information they're consuming. Because for the most part, if I wrote this as an actual book and sort of thought about this as, hey, there's, this is what's happening. I have to give it a detailed history and cite it. And there's lots of citations. It's backed up by research, but there is just a different language to being able to at least convey this larger metaphor in respect to inequality, racial inequality. I'm trying to make sure I get the question right. No, this was the off the cuff question.
But it's so there. I mean, I was just curious how you think about how you think about just the future of what's happening around with crypto and chat GPT. I mean, whether or not those things as you were writing and the experiences, particularly in the Black community, and the way that algorithms work and how we're influenced.
No, I had, and this is what I mean. There's so many areas that are along these lines in the respective, whether it be when the internet first started, people were like, well, the internet's a free space. It's going to be the place where equality reigns and so forth. And then the internet came around, and this turns out it's quite racist, and it's just in that space as well. But it's like every sort of next technology, every next step, there's some space. But that sort of speaks to, again, it's almost analogous to our search for explanations of race. There's sort of, in that world, there's this ideal space where it is fair, where it is equal. And if it's fair and equal in that space, then maybe it could be fair and equal in other spaces too. It's sort of the ideal. And so there's always, cannabis, this has been something of late. We can make reparations and we can make it fair in this space. And it turns out that there's all sorts of at least interesting things going on with different Black and brown owners in cannabis and organizations across states with equity policies. But it does, those were things that I thought about and pulling in. It was just really trying to regurgitate that there's a system, there is this machine that's out there, that's all beyond us, that we're just a part of. And it's just sort of kicking us back around. And if we look at it, depending on how we look at it, it changes things. And a long time ago, we had this dinner, actually, we were in Canada. And I was and this is when I was sort of fleshing out this book at that point in time. And I was talking to yourself and several others, but it's conveying, it's like I need to change the landscape. There's a way that we look at the world, and it's just, if we can change that, people can look at things in a slightly different way. And so this was, the book is both an informative sort of race text, but it's also a policy sort of statement in the respect that it's trying to do something to engage readers in a certain way, to incorporate individuals into a narrative of what's happening. In many respects, engage them in a very personal way. It looks like in a classroom where you're able to engage a person in a very personal way, to make them think about things in a different way. And that's what books do. That's one of the profound things. At least one of the reasons I love fiction is that you can look at things and you can just look at it from a slightly different perspective. One day you wake up and you see Asimov's robots. Asimov got hit really hard because they said the robots are like Black people and it's like enslaving robots and so forth. But sometimes you can interpret the robots as scientists or how we use. There's a variety of ways you can interpret anything. But the beautiful thing is that it gives you something new and ingenious each time. And it's no different than what we do now we have, instead of creating these fantastic stories with sort of in the context of a novel, sometimes we do it with statistics and data and other sorts of things. And the things are just as unreal. Education, we say that measures, years of education, you have 20 years of education, but it's like that has nothing to do with what, you know, we did for 6 years at Indiana, hanging out together. And it was crazy because the semester before he came to me and said, I taught race, and he came to me the next semester and he was like, so I need to take this class with you alone because I need to talk about what's going on in these race things. But yeah, I mean, the goal is again to get at that type of interaction with an individual, and get in many respects allow individuals to look at it from different perspectives and different vantages, to look at it, look at race from a slightly different vantage, but also see the world from a slightly different vantage. And so in that respect, it's both a policy statement, but a policy, yeah, it is a policy. It is an application.
Yes, my brother, in your question, the Bitcoin drowned it or you sandwiched it or it became twin. The issue of black men, black women you raised, that question got lost. Can you go back again?
Black.
Well, I mean, all I was saying about, in talking about black men and black women, I was making the point that they experience inequality differently in intersectional ways.
I wanted that question, I wanted to see how you respond.
Oh, okay.
No, that's a great point. No, so there is this notion, I mean, this is where it complicates things. I mean, we have intersectionality. It's like, and that's one of the areas that, again, this is the beauty of fiction is you can flatten the landscape, but there's a part towards the end where it complicate things to try to show that at least once you flatten the landscape in this way, but the notion of sort of who gets more and so forth, you can solve it. If you solve it in the traditional way, it becomes, you know, who has more resources. You know, do black women have more resources? Do black men have more resources? You start computing measures and so forth. But if the question becomes, they are all existing on a spectrum where some are getting more resources and others are systematically getting less resources, it becomes at least the solution, because it's a selfless solution. It doesn't pit individuals, you know, one against the other. It doesn't pit, you know, say, well, black women have this solution that's for their best interest and so forth. Or black men have this best solution. The best solution is selflessness. There's, you know, and that's sort of beyond that. And so that's where I do, in different respects, there is a particular section, I'm thinking of in part 6, where it engages, you know, what this model actually represents, and if it represents just race, or if it does it represent gender, because it's a very simple little mathematical model. But the goal is to convey that, you know, whether it's you have the model represent race, whether you have the model represent gender, whether you have the model represent, you know, these much more refined subcategories of race by gender and so forth, and you complicate it. The point is still that one group is getting more and another group is getting less, and the solution beyond that, regardless of, you know, how many groups or how you set it up, it's still that selflessness. And so, and this is there's a point towards the end where it's like race is just the example. You know, this is, if you think about these same principles are operating in different ways. If you look at populations inclusive not just of human beings but of plants and trees and the environment, it changes things because how are we stripping resources from these things? But it's a very similar relationship that's taking place. And so, but race is, I mean, this is one of the reasons I sort of build off social war and so forth, because it's an extraordinary example in that respect. It's because there is this binary, and there isn't this connection. I mean, there are arguments with respect to class emerging out of relationships between groups and so forth, or gender emerging out of historical relationships between gender and childbearing and child rearing and so forth. But what this is getting back to is like there's a distribution of resources, but it doesn't matter in this context again which one we're putting on, which one we're saying is primary. In the end, it's still selfless. Now, as an individual, you know, when I'm sitting in that situation and I'm arguing with my wife and she's saying, "I'm a black woman," and I don't understand. So it's, you know, I'm a little slow with it. I don't think there's a right answer in that respect. But again, that's the selfless answer is often hard to needs to be with. So, yeah. Did that get at your point?
No, I'm sorry. I'm going to just add one more stuff. To me, I think it's the biggest monster now is this explosion or incursion within the black resistance movement or the black struggle. To me, this whole issue, black people themselves, we ourselves are scared of dealing with what the system is doing or the machine is doing in meddling this schism of who is vertically mobile or not, which is in the end, even by your view, trite and benign. So for me, I think there's a big war waged. We are participating in a very bombastic way, especially the Hollywood negritude is playing a major role in bombastically deforming the struggle by bringing this gender politics that has no critical analysis, but emotional.
I think, and so, I mean, my point, at least in this context, is, and I think where I agree in many respects. The area that I will bring to it and that I will champion is that in any context, and so in historical movements, there have been different ways that certain voices have been silenced and other sorts of things. One of the things that I value in the current moment is, for the most part, people are saying, we want to hear your voice. We want it, and sometimes it may be women saying things like, y'all motherfuckers are doing us wrong or something, and the men may be saying something else. But I think the important point is, one, everybody needs to be heard. Everybody needs to have a voice, and everybody's voice is heard and respected. And I think in the context of creating that space, sometimes people have hurt feelings because we start thinking of the inequality Olympics, who gets what and so forth, who has what, and I think that creates a lot of difficulty. So I agree, but with the quick solution, I don't think there's a quick solution in that respect. But there's a bigger game afoot. But I think in the context of how we interact with each other, it's important that we recognize every individual, because historically we haven't necessarily. We might have said, we all play roles. You play this role, you play this role, and so forth. But we need to find a way so that everybody feels like they're represented, like they've been heard, because that's the essence of what we want to espouse, or at least I want to espouse in a larger society. That does, but I do agree that we do get caught in those politics, and how do we get past them? It's a good question. For me, again, I think pointing out that there's a bigger game afoot. How do we point that out in different ways, in different mediums, to point that sort of thing out? But it is something that is brought up, and we get confused and sort of distracted. But it's important and respected. People are heard.
We got a question online.
Okay.
Okay. So someone said, it's kind of a two-parter. It says the growing number of Afro, Latinx immigrants and multiracial Black individuals continues to change the Black population in the U.S. Do you think the machine and system will treat Black ethnic/immigrant/multiracial similarly or differently from their African American counterparts? How will this change the future of Black America?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking the question. It is something that I've done work in that area on immigration and race with Jeff Dixon a long time ago. But there is this change, and this is one of the things that's addressed early on in the book when you're talking about theory. When we had immigrants coming into the United States, there was a body of research for quite some time where people were sort of trying to figure out one of the questions was, why do Black immigrants do better than Black natives and so forth? They're in making the case that Black immigrants are of a different stock or something along those lines. But then there was another sort of group of individuals who were saying, well, Mbela Bashi was sort of part of them, Skufu was also part of them, saying that, well, no, immigrants are migrating into a racialized system. So when they get here, they might not be Black before they get here, but once they come here, they're Black. And so the idea is that they're sort of plugged into the machine. But in the context of this machine, what research has shown is that Black immigrants are treated differently in the machine, in the respect that Black immigrants often are treated by employers differently. They're seen as more agreeable laborers and so forth. And one of the things that it speaks to the other side of it, because lots of individuals who receive those rewards are, it's like, hey, what should I do? Maybe I should talk with a little bit heavier an accent. Maybe I should tell people where I'm from, something along that. But so what I'm getting at is there is a machine that individuals are migrating into. And to the extent that, and this is, I mean, we often think about individuals migrating in and sort of changing the racial structure. In this respect, what we've seen though, just recently, is that more and more Afro-Latinos are migrating to the U.S. I mean, when migrating in, they're migrating into the racial structure of the United States. And they're becoming black over time, or they're becoming, it depends on the different racial groups. But one of the things we've seen is that, this is my work in this area, that when we compare black immigrants and black natives with their counterparts, immigrants, I mean, on average, just earn more money than natives in different respects. But black immigrants earn much less than their white immigrant counterparts. And so they're experiencing race, but they're experiencing race as immigrants. And so it's like gender, but it's like they're immigrants. And it's like, well, is immigration playing the role, or is it race? And so there is this complication going on there. But again, there is the point in the context of the book is to make this case that, hey, there is this system. And it is, we can complicate the system, we can make it really, different in different ways to try to map onto different levels of inequality with immigrants and so forth. But the point still is that one group is getting more resources than another. And it could be a really fine distribution of based on race and immigrant status and gender, how many resources you're getting and so forth. But whether we map that actual distribution out and how it works, it still doesn't get past the point that, hey, there's this zero-sum game. One group is getting more than another group. And in the context of that type of zero-sum game where people are interacting and creating this inequality because they become black. Because it's funny, some of the research shows that the black children of West Indian immigrants, this is work in New York, that if they were middle class, if they did well for themselves, they were still West Indians. But the ones who didn't do well for themselves, they became black in the next generation. And so it was like this really sort of weird situation. So if you're like a second generation West Indian, you're really doing well. It's like, well, there's a bunch of folks who aren't. And it's this racial migration that's taking place as well, where people are seeing the similarity. But there's a lot going on here, again, like the gender aspect of it, because within communities, even though we're a whole connected and so forth, but within communities, people see these benefits, and maybe the benefit of women in a socially connected labor force, and there's just so much more resources for black women in the labor force. With respect to network connections than black men, it may be something along the lines of immigrants being able to get more resources, more likelihood to get a job, because employers are not only racist, but they prefer certain types of black people than other types of black people. But there's a larger system, a larger game afoot. And that's what the goal is, to really point to that and get people thinking. But that's a great question. And it is something that we're grappling with.
It was from your friend, I'm assuming your friend, Ryan J. Cobb. They said, thank you for answering the question and your mentorship, Quincy and Ray.
Shout out to Ryan. Other questions from the audience here for Dr. Stewart. We covered a lot of ground. Talked about a lot of things. On this last point that you were just making, I think it's powerful to think about, and you talk about this in the book, right? Immigration comes in terms of showing, as you just noted, that people are still experiencing race, even if it's in a different way. In a way that second generation, particularly third generation, black immigrants become, like their outcomes look similar to native born black people. And I think that speaks to how this machine is working.
Just a quick question. I want to go into immigration because you guys got the data versus someone here say I have. Certain immigration groups, I'm not going to use the West Indians for the most part, but other immigration groups, particularly from Africa, have we looked at the socioeconomic aspects of how that group, that base group foundation is coming over? Indians, Africans, stuff like that. What status they are coming in? Because there's some, like I said, I don't have the data per se like you guys, but are somewhat elite in their country sending theirs over here so they get a certain different preference than American blacks.
So there is this mechanism with respect to sort of selection within within immigration, where certain immigrant groups, immigrants, and it's a process of selection in general. Immigrants are different than the people that don't immigrate. They're more motivated. There's something about them. We can't figure out what it is. This sort of speaks to Google's incompleteness. We can't figure out what the hell it is, but there's something special about them. I mean, they live longer, all sorts of cool stuff. Immigrants, when you start looking, if you sort of compare immigrants with immigrants, but I mean, that's one of the ways you get around that, is you don't compare immigrants to natives, because if you compare immigrants with natives, they're different from the populations they leave. They're distinct, and they're different from the populations they land in. But African immigrants they have higher levels of education, like Indian immigrants, Asian Indian immigrants, and several other groups. And so, in these things, these statistics we've been talking about, these I've been talking about, it controls for those sorts of things. And so it's comparing individuals who are in the same socioeconomic status. Okay. I mean, this is sort of the fantastical thing of statistics. This is the wizardry. It's saying that, hey, what's the average difference between like actors and so forth? And that's the good thing about statistics. That's what it can do. It can tell you, given all people, all different characteristics otherwise, what's the average difference between blacks, whites, Latinxes, and so forth within that category. And that consistently shows that, regardless, this is one of the areas where that statistic, it changes things for Asian Americans, because it looks like Asian Americans earn more than their white counterparts. But once you control for that, it changes things. It's just like controlling for a space, geographic space. Asians live in high-priced cities, and it just changes things. But once you do those sorts of manipulations, you still see the big race effect, both amongst immigrants and amongst natives. It's a similar, actually, in some respects, sometimes they're bigger in the immigrant population than they are in the native population. But again, that's amongst individuals who are, of similar education and so forth.
Or I guess I have a comment, because I think I've noticed this phenomena in my own family, particularly because I'm third generation from Anguilla. Now, my father wouldn't necessarily say he's Anguillan, you know what I mean? But my grandmother, she's first gen, so she was probably the only one who really shared the culture with us at all. And basically, from what my father said, they never really embraced West Anguillan culture while they were in America. Like, my great grandparents pretty much made it a point to assimilate. Like, they were not trying to bang with Anguilla. Whatever happened in Anguilla, they wanted to leave behind. And so, but I have another part of our family that, my dad's cousin, who is the exact same age. All three generations of his family claim Anguilla hard, and they are ostensibly doing better, in terms of social stratification.
Yeah.
And I think it's because they held on to the culture, and I think by my great grandparents denouncing, or not necessarily denouncing, but not holding on to Anguillan culture and instilling that in our family, that shifted us into, I guess, blackness, and not to say that blackness is inherently wrong or anything like that, because on my mom's side, you're a typical American Negro, black from the South and mixed with Native American and whatever else. It's just interesting that you put this into a
thing. Families, it's always funny. My family's from Louisiana, and there is this cynical sort of way. I love my great-grandmother and my grandmother, but they used to talk to me some wicked ways about my hair, about my complexion, about everything about me. But that was just who they were. But it was a similar type of process. But one to sort of speak to what you were saying, that this is the sort of thinking about structure. As one begins to think, not necessarily holding on causes one or the other, but to think about, perhaps one holds on because one is responding to destruction. Maybe there are resources that are there within the community. Maybe it's an enclave, or maybe it's just that you hold on because you're feeling good and it's cool. I mean, one of the things that it was one of the personable sorts of things that at Penn we had lots of African graduate students in demography, because it's just more of a bigger field abroad. But those that went in the United States to get jobs, it was interesting because once they went on the market, things changed. It's anecdotal in the respect, but it was the conversations about race became more had more merit in the respects of one's facing the job market here. But I think that aspect of it plays a role. The opportunities that one has available to oneself, how how you interpret the environment and so forth. But again, it's an interesting area where you start spanning sort of nuanced areas, these spaces like that.
Absolutely. And
But also, brother, I think, I don't know, the facts I think I know is the highly educated population of the African race is Black American. Scientifically, economically, they're the most desired in many parts of Africa, from the Nkrumah time to now, were to get African Americans, especially in my country, in Ethiopia, during the war, during the Italian invasion, pilots came from African Americans. So I think African students of the 1970s, late 60s, what I would call continentally the children of Kennedy, in Americanizing the educational mindset of the Black bourgeoisie in Africa is one set. But since immigration opened this lottery system, working class Africans who don't even speak English are in America economically, vertically making impact in Uber and taxi and what have you, in Chicago, here and New York. So to me, I think the contemporary African strategically behaves not to appear threatening to white supremacist paradigm. The other thing is we don't, immigrants don't bring the baggage of slavery, which is immediately a pointing finger of accusation to every white American. So to me, that I felt is something that I have observed.
No, there is a difference in how, I love this because it deals with sort of how we have internalized race ourselves, how we think about race. And so there's, in Mary Waters' work, she did this work on race and immigration in New York City and so forth. But the cool thing about it, at least what I found fascinating is how individuals they internalized expectations on the basis of who they were, and so they realized that hey, these employers prefer this sort of thing. Okay, that's the system. I'll respond and I'll play up this and I'll play up my ties over here and so forth. It's like you're playing the game, and so in that respect, I think in this world of how individuals are responding to the environment, I think it's natural to see those sorts of distinctions with individuals, sort of whether they're playing up ethnicity or playing up different markers and so forth or not. But again, I think that's all a part of this larger system, and we can think about that as gender. We can think about that as dress. We can think about that as just a variety of ways where we're articulating whiteness in this huge system. And it's very complicated, but we try to sort of mathematically parse it out. But it's still a part of this larger system.
Just to back up on his question real quick, would you think that the reason why they're able to, for lack of a better word, play the game better is because African Americans were placed in a let's be realistic, a more prisoner of war aspect versus most African countries were colonized. Therefore, the interplay between the groups were different on the continent versus it was here. It was a less, for lack of a better word, a little less confrontational on the continent.
So one of those points, I said it in a different way, I'll say it more elegantly now, is that sometimes individuals coming from another country who immigrate into this racialized system, they don't understand the race the way we do. And so something happens in an interaction, it's not racist for them. And so that elicits a different response. It may look like, hey, they just let it roll off their back, but it's like, they may not even see that shit. You know? But that creates a different outcome. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's that sort of thing. And that's sort of the idea of how an individual has been sort of patterned and how they've been looking at things. And so it may create a situation where individuals don't see certain things. And that's part of the point of, when we see these children of immigrants sort of becoming black and so forth, and certain groups and so forth. It's almost, sometimes you start to wonder, it's like, can they begin to see this stuff? Are they experiencing these things, and are they seeing these things just from a slightly different vantage? And so instead of saying, I don't understand interpersonal racism because you're not interacting with whites on an everyday basis and seeing things in that way, you're seeing things from a more structural perspective. It changes how one responds in the environment.
But
And by the way, I'm
racism
sorry.
is a tool to keep the oppressed from coming together. It's part of the big system.
This is Mark's question. This is one of those things where race is it's part of status. This is where Du Bois, it's funny because he had his books, Black, what is the last one, on Black Reconstruction. Black Reconstruction was one of the big book talks a little bit about structure in different ways, the wages of whiteness and so forth. But before that, he wrote a novel, actually, The Quest of the Silver Fleece. The neat thing about it is, in the context of that, he's telling a story about capitalism, he's telling a story about slavery. He's showing you that it's all wrapped up into it. So it's really involved. And so race becomes a form of status that individuals hold on to. Wages of whiteness, it becomes this thing. And so could it be that people are, and this sort of speaks to the many theories can be operating at the same time. Could it be that whites are looking around saying, I want to keep my status and I don't want to keep separate from these individuals? Yeah, that could be working at the same time. But race is operating. And that is, in many respects, what white workers may be advocating for and are a part of, is to maintain the status of that in the context. And we've done this in different ways. We've done it with educational certificates, and we've hacked those. And we've done it with, as African Americans, we've just been hacking these systems that people create for years. But with respect to this notion of dividing I don't necessarily. I think it's a good question for a debate to talk about in class or something along those lines. How it works, I think it's working amongst many other theories. Possibly, you could possibly say that it looks like that sometimes when you look at it through one perspective. But for me, that's not as important as there's this thing called race and it's happening. It may be that sometimes it looks like workers are fighting against each other, and other times it may look like discriminating from employers coming down on each other, and other times it may look like everyday individuals in the street just being an asshole. But it looks in a variety of ways and a variety of theories. But I think again, a lot of these theories are correct at different points. But that's cool. But there's a bigger issue. The issue is how we're distributing resources in the context of social interactions.
But I just want to add one thing. I think so we don't get misunderstood. It's very important that immigrants, for example, European immigrants coming to the idea of white America is one thing, like the Polish, the Irish, etc. We can go. But when you talk about these immigrants we're talking about, in fact, there's a schism between this newly immigrant Africans and their newly born children. In fact, there's a saying, don't act like a black American. You're acting like a black American, because the children are becoming very militant. In fact, in a lot of the Afro-American organizations across this country, from Lansing, Michigan to Stanford, you find immigrant children are in the leadership of black nationalism. This again shows, I think, the whiteness, you can ignore it as an immigrant. You may not even, as you said, I agree with you, it takes years to see it. You can't see it, but their children are now fracturing the so-called smooth entry into the country.
Yeah.
I think that is a serious now immigrant problem across this country.
No, I mean, in the context of, I mean, this is, it's complicated in the respect that immigrant individuals are sort of immigrating again into a racialized system, and they're sort of jockeying into their place. They're making the adjustments on themselves. The country's, the country's not necessarily adjusting. It's sort of more so slotting, how individuals sort of fit into the resource system. And of course, it changes over time. But no, it is something that's, and you do see this at premier universities, but more and more of the student body that are African American or classified as Black are children of immigrants. And it's one of the things that people have argued about for a long time. And the affirmative action programs and so forth, these programs are benefiting not children of Native, but children of immigrants. And it is a topic that's being discussed. And it is something that, I find it fascinating just seeing on a college campus, just because you see within, they don't have, they do have different organizations for different groups, but there's still the Black Student Association, and that's everybody. But it is, I don't know, I find it fascinating what's happening, and I'm kind of curious where it's going to go, because especially now, more and more people are becoming open to just this idea of people need to be heard. We just can't silence a voice. We can't say, so-and-so, we could ignore them for this point in time and so forth. And so I think the more and more we encourage individuals to speak their voices, and whether bringing up topics like this, which is something we don't just discuss that often, we sort of mention it in passing, but discuss it in more depth, and the benefits to certain individuals versus others, I think it's an important question. I say benefits in the respect that there are, whether an individual, you think historically, whether this counts as reparations and individuals are trying to go through affirmative action programs and so forth or not, whether it's a form of that type of program. But in the sense that is it a program that's geared towards at least undermining systemic inequality? And how does it do that? But in the context of that, again, going back to just how systems work, redistributing education doesn't undermine the system of inequality. Especially it's kind of like housing in the respect that just white people just move someplace else. We develop a new certificate. Yes, it's just things happen, but it happens in different dimensions, in ways.
All right, you mentioned that the creation of the internet, there was this buzz, and I kind of remember this around college time that the internet proliferation of this was supposed to be like a racist place where Blacks could excel because there wasn't racism. We found that wasn't true. Then there was explosion of with that, off at STEM, and even now you have all these Black charter STEM schools, and STEM is constantly pushed to our kids. But I have friends that work in big tech, and they'll tell you some of the most racist environments they've worked in, whether it be Facebook, Netflix, Google, even to Airbnb. Nevertheless, that's an area that's not working. Now Blacks are diving into crypto, and I've had these heated, passionate discussions about how I need to buy more Bitcoin, and I got cousins that are like, this is gonna be our liberation. There was a book out, a guy had Black American liberation through cryptocurrency. Once crypto bubble bursts, those guys are pretty solid right now. I'm looking at every time there's new technology or some new pattern of lifestyle of living. I think back to limited knowledge I know of this once the 70s came around, affirmative action, things like that, we thought this was going to be some major change, but it didn't. When are Blacks, or do we think we'll see collectively that people are going to see it's the system itself, not every little new wave or new wave of technology that's not going to liberate. The system is set up to always keep you oppressed, and I think we've lost collectively the mindset to try to learn the system and undermine it or be subversive. We now have been, especially with Black pop media, there's this big push to be part of it, whether it be the Black capitalist movement, even, it's really frustrating, disappointing to see the, hip hop artists, especially from the 90s, we were, totally against the system. Now it's no, you got to get your LLC together. You got to get your crypto up. This is no, brother. That wasn't what it was about. So when are we gonna start seeing the system as the problem?
No, that's a great question. I mean, that speaks to the nature of the system, because we think of systems, again, we think of it like there's this, a structure, an educational structure, or this system or that system. We don't see this as the entirety of a system, a racist system, and how we introduce things. And that's kind of the point towards the end, because I think it's important for individuals to realize that we're trapped. Because if you don't realize you're trapped, you keep hacking. You keep saying, well, if I just get enough education, I could be, and when we're doing those things, it sounds crazy, but I mean, we're saying, I'm different from that black guy over there.
Yeah,
That black guy
exactly.
in the corner, he may not have an education, but I do. I'm safe. Those sorts of things. But it's that hacking. But I think there's a certain point, and I try to bring this in a few ways, trying to make the reader feel trapped and feel frustrated and feel, just like you've been capped off. And the goal is to really situate oneself in an environment of where loss is almost, there's no right way to act. And when there's no right way to act, what do? You do just what's the best thing, what's the greatest good? And then there's a selfless action. There's a different way. And part of that has to do with holding space and other sorts of things. There's the way that it's interesting because the way that different religions talk about the same sort of pivotal moment of inaction at different points. How do you? But one has to be trapped. That's the at least for me the critical point is finding that trap. And so it's not to say that Black Americans say we need to find the trap and I'll lead you to the way. This is the promised land. And so forth. But I think this is a practice of realizing, one, just seeing the landscape as this place is implicitly racist. And no, it's not just go out and get education. It's not, tweak this math thing here, not tweak this. This place is racist. And it's bad because we're sitting here and you have your kids and it's like, well, what should we do? It's like, well, I don't want you to live poor, so you should go get an education and make sure you're different from the black folk over there. So you can be decent and live a decent life. But that's what we do. But that makes sense. But in actuality, we're still in that trap. We're still because in this space, whiteness is associated with status. And one of the reasons that education is valuable is because white people have it and black people generally don't. It varies, it goes across different spaces like this. White people have certain things and it endows value to those things in different ways. And when we go after those things, it undermines our capacity to sort of seek equality. And so we are trapped in this respect. And so I think that one, realizing the trap, and it's not a new trap. This is something Du Bois talked about years ago. People have talked about this trap forever, but I think it's in the context of realizing that trap, it's coming to the conclusion that it's not just about finding more shit. It's not about getting, my share of what's out here. It's about we have to fundamentally change this. And the way that I can fundamentally change this is not thinking about what's best for me, but by thinking about what's best for the entire good, what's selfless, what's the best action now for the selfless action in a certain situation. So in that respect, it's trying to, and so that's one of the reasons I'm trying to create a trap. And I tell my students, when I taught my grad students in the class you took years ago, I asked them every few weeks, I'm drawing pictures on the board and doing all these bottles and stuff. And I asked them, like, you feel trapped yet? And they're like, no, I'm good. And then it's like, okay. A few weeks later, it's like, you feel trapped? Usually after structural race theory, you're just like, shit. I can't get out of this. This is really nasty. And then we go a bit further into it, but there's a point where you begin to see this as, I can't get out of this. And I think we've come at different points in time where, and we've used different selfless techniques at different points in time to really start thinking about what a society looks like that's selfless. What does a society look like? And that's, at least from my vantage, the way to begin to see this. But I don't think the selfless solution becomes apparent until you feel trapped. Until you feel like nothing else, I can't hack my way out of this.
Yeah, Black people's behaviors oftentimes, and all of our positives and negatives, oftentimes rational responses to the machine, to the system of race. And so, look, this has been an invigorating conversation. I hope you all have felt the same way. Let's give it up for Sankofa. Let's give it up to Dr. Quincy Stewart, Race in the Machine. Black, support Black, get a book, and have Dr. Stewart sign it. So Quincy, as always, thank you for the opportunity. I continue to learn immensely from you, and will be thinking forever about the things that you say and the things that you put down on paper. So thank you. Cheers.
Thank you all for coming out.